December 1987. Over the Norwegian Sea, 03:11 hours. The sky was empty, moonless, and cold. Far below, Soviet radar installations on the Kola Peninsula tracked a high-altitude contact at 41,000 feet. Its signature was faint, its transponder silent. It wasn't turning, it wasn't descending, it was just circling, slowly, patiently. A MiG-31 scrambled from Rogachevo Air Base to intercept. By the time the interceptor reached its search grid, the contact was gone, vanished into the Arctic dark. But 90 minutes later, the exact same radar blip reappeared, further south now, still at 41,000 feet, still unresponsive, not a missile, not a satellite, not a glitch. The Soviets had seen this before, and they feared it. It was a B-52 Stratofortress. But this wasn't the part that terrified Soviet generals. The horror was in the timestamp. The same B-52 had been tracked earlier that day off the coast of Greenland, then again at the edge of Icelandic airspace, and now over the Norwegian Sea. More than 28 hours into its flight, and still operating at full mission tempo. It had not returned to base. It had not landed. It had refueled midair, multiple times, and was still airborne, still circling, still within strike range of Soviet territory, with at least 6 more hours of loiter time logged in its projected route. Soviet Air Defense Command issued a Level 3 tracking alert. But there was nothing to intercept. No attack. No bombing run. Just a single American bomber that refused to leave. Inside the Kremlin's Air Defense Operations Center, one general whispered what no one wanted to admit. It's not flying a mission. It is the mission. The B-52 had become more than a strategic bomber. It had become a symbol of endurance, of pressure, of constant, inescapable presence. Unlike faster, stealthier aircraft, it wasn't meant to sneak in and vanish. It was designed to hover on the edge of strike zones for hours, days even, forcing Soviet commanders to remain on constant alert, draining resources, stretching response grids, and keeping the possibility of annihilation alive every second it remained in the air. This wasn't a single incursion. It was psychological warfare in slow motion. 35 hours, one aircraft, no landing, no retreat. Just the dull, terrifying fact that it was still up there. From the 1950s through the late 1980s, Soviet strategic planners treated long-range American bombers as powerful but limited threats. The assumption was simple and seemingly logical. Even the most capable aircraft had to land eventually. In Soviet war doctrine, bombers were modeled as fast strike platforms. Their threat windows were predictable. After takeoff, they would cruise, approach a target zone, release payloads, conventional or nuclear, and retreat. The entire mission, by necessity, would last perhaps 10 to 14 hours, depending on range and refueling. Long, but finite, because all aircraft, even bombers, required fuel. And fuel was a constraint. At least, that's what Moscow believed. They factored these assumptions into everything, from interceptor patrol schedules to radar coverage grids and even nuclear retaliation protocols. Soviet air defense planners viewed bombers as blitz instruments, not persistent ones. You caught them on approach, or you braced for impact. But then came the B-52. It wasn't fast, it wasn't stealthy, and it didn't look menacing on radar. Yet it rewrote every Soviet assumption, not with a roar but with duration. Supported by a web of KC-135 Stratotanker refueling aircraft, the B-52 could remain in the sky for over 35 hours, and not just in transit but on station, orbiting Soviet airspace like a vulture with nukes. It didn't have to strike to be effective. It only had to be there. This challenged every layer of Soviet response logic. If a bomber could stay airborne across 2 full calendar days, refueling 3 or 4 times, updating its mission mid-flight, switching target packets, then what point was there in scrambling interceptors at all? By the time a MiG was airborne, the B-52 could be hundreds of kilometers away, beyond radar range, or looping back around for another approach from a different angle. Worse yet, This persistence meant the B-52 could launch from anywhere, Louisiana, Guam, RAF Fairford, and still reach Soviet territory without ever touching a runway. This broke the core planning premise of Soviet air defense: linear threat progression. The B-52 introduced a cyclical threat model, an aircraft that, through endurance alone, defied scheduling, confused predictive radar, and erased the comfort of downtime. One Soviet aerospace analyst, after reviewing a 32-hour B-52 flight record during a NATO drill, admitted in a closed meeting, "Our clocks are wrong. They think the air war is a sprint, but it's a marathon. And they brought food." The Americans didn't need to win with faster aircraft. They only needed to stay in the sky longer than the Soviets could respond. And no aircraft in the Soviet arsenal, not the Tu-95 Bear, not the M4 Bison, could match that. What the Soviets saw as weakness, slowness, size, age, was actually the B-52's greatest strength. It wasn't built to escape. It was built to wait you out. Soviet air defense doctrine was structured like a chess game. Fixed pieces, clear rules, predictable moves. Radar coverage was layered by altitude bands. Interceptor squadrons were assigned sectors based on projected incursion windows. Surface-to-air missile batteries formed concentric zones around high-value targets. Every part of this system depended on one critical assumption: hostile bombers would move fast, strike quickly, and then exit the battle space. Soviet thinking didn't account for a bomber that never left. The B-52 Stratofortress was born in the 1950s, but it was in the 1980s, re-engineered, refueled, and reconceptualized, that it became a doctrinal nightmare. American commanders had realized something simple and devastating. By combining midair refueling with route flexibility, the B-52 didn't need to commit to a strike path. It could hover on the edge of Soviet detection and wait for conditions to shift. Soviet doctrine broke here. Their radar arrays, massive, analog, meticulously calculated, were tuned for committed threats. An incoming bomber? Track it. A missile launch? Log the arc. But what happens when the threat doesn't attack? What happens when it just lingers? Orbiting, circling, staying. The Soviet response structure wasn't agile enough. Interceptor pilots were not trained for false alarms stretched across days. SAM operators were conditioned to respond to imminent threats, not loitering ones. Command centers had no standing procedures for a bomber that re-entered airspace 18 hours after its last radar contact. More dangerously, strategic planners assumed a launch or retreat model. Once a bomber got close, it had to fire or withdraw. B-52s upended this by playing the long game, using their persistence to probe air defenses, test response times, and even double back through earlier corridors after presumed withdrawal. It created doctrinal fatigue. Do you intercept now or wait? Will they refuel and circle back? Is this one of the decoys, or is this the live bird? One Soviet air regiment commander later confessed during a debrief, "We couldn't plan because they didn't follow plans. Our maps showed ranges. Their planes erased the concept of distance." The B-52 didn't just extend range, it distorted time. It introduced a new kind of warfare where the threat wasn't immediate destruction, it was permanent pressure. Unlike high-speed strikes, which ended in minutes, B-52 pressure lasted entire shifts, entire rotations, entire days. This wasn't a design flaw in Soviet doctrine. It was a design assumption, built on a world where aircraft had limits. Now, the Americans were flying machines that operated like airborne siege weapons, circling the perimeter until the defenders broke down, not from bombs, but from exhaustion. And Soviet doctrine had no answer for that. In November 1983, as NATO conducted its annual Able Archer exercise, something deeply unsettling occurred over the North Atlantic, a flight that would shatter the last illusions of Soviet strategic planners. An American B-52H Stratofortress, call sign Sledgehammer 5, was logged lifting off from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota at Euro 217 local time. Its declared route, transatlantic, with a simulated strike profile over the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. But by the time it reached waypoint Echo 12, it didn't turn back. Instead, it executed a slow, looping orbit off the coast of Iceland. 2 hours passed, then 6, then 10. Soviet radar on the Kola Peninsula began tracking what appeared to be the same bomber, holding altitude at 42,000 feet, constantly maneuvering but never leaving the general area. It was being refueled midair, not once, but 3 times, via KC-135 tankers rotating in from the UK and Canada. After 18 hours aloft, the B-52 repositioned, entering the simulated launch corridor for a mock strike run on Eastern Europe. Soviet air defense scrambled 2 interceptors from the 641st Fighter Regiment, but by the time they arrived in radar range, the B-52 had turned again, reassuming a patrol orbit, undeterred. At hour 25, the bomber began releasing chaff clouds and radar jamming bursts, not just as defensive measures, but in coordination with simulated decoy missiles dropped from altitude. Electronic warfare logs captured by Soviet SIGINT units confirmed it. The B-52 wasn't running on fumes. It was running a full-spectrum strike rehearsal at hour 25 of continuous flight. By hour 29, it repositioned again, triggering a second scramble from Soviet interceptor squadrons. Same result. No contact, no breach, no withdrawal, just presence. It wasn't until hour 34, nearly a day and a half after launch, that Sledgehammer 5 finally left Soviet radar coverage, returning to North American airspace. Total distance flown, over 15,000 kilometers. Number of refuels, 4. Time in the sky, 34 hours, 18 minutes. Back in Moscow, GRU analysts cross-checked signals logs, refueling tracks, and ELIENT intercepts. The conclusion was stunning. It wasn't a series of planes. It was one plane. One plane, orbiting within launch range of Soviet territory for an entire day and a half, supported by a global logistical system that allowed it to act as a persistent nuclear threat without ever landing. The next morning, Soviet Air Marshal Evgeny Shaposhnikov reportedly stared at the mission log and said flatly, "This isn't a bomber. This is a station." For the first time, the Soviet Union understood the scale of the problem. They weren't tracking a strike event. They were tracking a presence event, a persistent, self-sustaining platform that could appear, remain, and vanish on its own timetable, draining defenses and unraveling the very idea of airspace sovereignty. The impossible wasn't that a B-52 could survive that long. The impossible was that it could choose not to land. The after-action report from Able Archer 83 stunned Soviet analysts. But not everyone in Moscow was convinced. Inside the General Staff's Air Defense Directorate, skepticism turned into full-blown denial. 34 hours airborne, 4 in-flight refuelings, chaff, jamming, and decoys still functional after a full day in the sky? Impossible, one colonel declared in the closed session. American propaganda. The prevailing theory was that the West had staged the logs, that multiple B-52s had swapped positions mid-flight, sharing transponder codes to create the illusion of endurance. According to this logic, NATO wanted to scare the Warsaw Pact into overextending their air defenses and buying into the myth of the omnipresent bomber. And for a time, this lie held. The KGB dismissed satellite reports as Western disinformation. Interceptor pilots who'd chased phantom contacts in the Norwegian Sea were told their radars had misread weather returns. The endurance claims were labeled exaggerated, and the discussion shifted toward updating interceptor alert times, not rewriting doctrine. But the data kept coming. A month later, a different B-52, this time call sign Echo Wolf, was tracked circling the Arctic for over 30 hours during a NORAD mobility drill. Soviet SIGINT stations picked up encrypted command updates and refueling coordination chatter well into hour 28 of the flight. Still, Air Defense Command argued it must have been relay stations or airborne AWACS drones. Then came the fatigue reports. Captured through human intelligence from U.S. logistics contracts, these logs detailed crew rest rotations, mission planning for 36-hour endurance windows, and spare engine cycles calibrated for flights exceeding 30 hours. These weren't propaganda pieces. They were maintenance schedules, logs, routine entries in an air force that had made endurance normal. Finally, in March 1984, Soviet radar units in eastern Poland reported something unthinkable. The same B-52, tail number confirmed via ELINT, returning to a patrol orbit it had held 26 hours earlier. It had left, it had refueled, and it had come back. This time there were no interceptors launched, no scramble, no tracking escalation. The realization had settled in. The Americans were not bluffing. The B-52 could circle, it could wait, it could probe defenses, fake withdrawals, and come back just when Soviet systems had stood down. In one internal GRU briefing, the phrase scrawled in red marker across the top of the whiteboard read, "Their bomber no longer obeys our timing." This changed everything. It meant the airspace wasn't a theater. It was a trap, and the B-52 was the bait, dangling endlessly, wearing down Soviet attention spans, forcing alert crews to remain at stations for days without rest, waiting for an attack that might never come. And the most damning truth? That B-52 wasn't acting at the edge of its range. It was acting inside its design window, not an outlier, not a dare, a standard mission. With mounting evidence and radar confirmation piling up, Soviet intelligence scrambled to save face by forming a counter-theory. If it was true that a single B-52 could remain airborne for more than 30 hours, then it couldn't possibly be doing so alone. The new theory proposed that these weren't solo missions at all, but rotating squadrons faking continuity. According to GRU assessments circulated in April 1984, the United States had devised a handoff deception model, a relay system where multiple B-52s shared the same airspace and transponder identity, seamlessly switching between tankers and orbits to maintain the illusion of one persistent bomber. Each aircraft, the Soviets argued, only flew 10 to 12 hours at a time. This theory was supported by a flawed but attractive assumption. American airframes were too old, too analog, too inefficient to handle ultra-long missions. The Soviets knew their own long-range Tu-95 Bear could not fly beyond 17 hours without mechanical stress or crew degradation. Surely the B-52, designed a decade earlier, was no different. The theory gained traction because it aligned with Soviet limitations, not American capability. But it fell apart under its own weight. First, radar cross-section analysis contradicted the handoff idea. Data gathered from Soviet early warning radar in the Barents and Black Sea regions showed identical thermal and acoustic signatures, engine harmonics, vibration patterns, even tail fin echo readings, over 30-hour periods. That wasn't a handoff. That was the same aircraft. Second, satellite reconnaissance captured B-52s refueling not just once, but multiple times in the same orbit. Infrared footage recorded KC-135s pulling alongside and departing repeatedly, sometimes 5 or 6 times in the same mission cycle. No squadron relay could match that kind of synchronized dance. Third, and most devastating, the Soviets intercepted live SIGINT broadcasts from the B-52 crews themselves, acknowledging time on target windows at hour 29, and even logging rest schedules inside the cockpit. U.S. crews weren't swapping out. They were just trained, dosed, and rotating sleep mid-air. The aircraft itself was a flying operations center with redundant command capability and dual control stations, allowing the Stratofortress to function as a persistent rotating strike team. The theory finally collapsed during a joint NATO exercise when a B-52, confirmed by tail number and signature, launched decoys and ECM patterns over 2 separate zones, 12 hours apart, without ever touching land. The Soviets were forced to admit that this was not deception. This was design. What they had interpreted as misdirection was actually precision endurance, the result of training, planning, and systems-level integration the Soviets hadn't replicated. One air doctrine officer wrote privately, "We've accused them of switching planes. They've simply learned how not to stop." The wrong theory crumbled, and what replaced it was far more dangerous. An acceptance that the enemy could stay in your airspace longer than your own alert crews could remain awake. Even after the Soviet military accepted that B-52s were staying airborne for 30 hours or more, another false theory took hold, one that sought to diminish the threat by shifting the conversation from flight endurance to functional endurance. This time, analysts insisted that while the aircraft could remain aloft, its systems couldn't. Soviet electronics experts reasoned that extended time in the air would lead to sensor drift, coolant degradation, and increased noise in electronic warfare suites. After 20 hours or more, the theory claimed, the B-52's radar, jamming equipment, and communications would begin to malfunction or lose precision, rendering the aircraft little more than a flying fuel tank. This theory gave hope. It suggested a window of vulnerability, a point in time when the B-52 became blind, unable to execute strikes, transmit data, or confuse Soviet radar systems. All Moscow had to do was outweight the bird. But again, they were wrong. By the mid-1980s, B-52s had been retrofitted with modular ECM pods, automated thermal regulation, and backup circuit redundancies. In effect, the aircraft had been converted into a self-healing electronic fortress, capable of suppressing, spoofing, and resisting Soviet radar, even after 2 full days aloft. One intercepted ECM log from a B-52 during a 33-hour mission shocked Soviet engineers. The jammer was still broadcasting at 97% baseline strength after hour 29. American onboard systems automatically rotated power usage across frequency ranges to prevent thermal overload, keeping sensors stable and interference sharp. Moreover, the B-52's radar systems, particularly the AN/APQ-166 in the H model, had integrated self-calibration routines, refreshing scan fidelity, even after dozens of hours of continuous operation. Where Soviet sensors required technician intervention to maintain clarity, American systems corrected themselves in flight. Even communication systems, once thought to be a bottleneck, used mid-air satellite uplinks and burst transmission relays. These allowed B-52s to send updated strike coordinates, receive launch permissions, and even deliver encrypted strategic messages at hour 30, just as cleanly as at hour 3. Still, Soviet officers clung to this second wrong theory because the alternative was terrifying. It meant that at any hour of any day, a B-52 could be circling overhead, fully functional, fully armed, and perfectly aware of its target. It could jam your radar, feed your missile crews false echoes, and transmit decoy maneuvers without fatigue. It meant you weren't being hunted by a tired relic. You were being watched by a rested predator, its endurance matched only by its system's precision. One Soviet air defense colonel finally admitted the truth in a restricted meeting. We told ourselves they were decaying in flight, but we were the ones decaying. This second theory died like the first, slowly, reluctantly, with red-faced revisions and white-knuckled silence in the war rooms. And with it died the last hope that time alone would solve the B-52 problem. Because time, it turned out, was what the B-52 did better than anyone. Every great military collapse begins not on the battlefield, but in the silence of an unasked question. For the Soviet Union, that question was simple. What if the B-52 doesn't leave? In the 1980s, Soviet air defense grids were a marvel of layered engineering. Early warning radars tracked high-altitude threats. MiG-25 and MiG-31 interceptors stood ready across dozens of bases. S-200 and S-300 surface-to-air missile batteries ringed the borderlands like iron teeth. But all of it, every alert, every response, every scramble, was designed around transient threats, fast-flying, single-path incursions, bombers that approached, struck, and disappeared. The system was calibrated to react within a narrow window, then stand down. The B-52 flipped that logic. It didn't approach and strike. It waited, it orbited, it returned, it stayed. This was the flaw. Not technical, not mechanical. Doctrinal. Soviet detection assets were robust, but not persistent. Radar operators logged contacts in intervals, assuming those outside the sector had left. There was no cross-shift protocol for tracking a single aircraft over 2 or more days. Once a B-52 left a given zone, its flight was usually considered complete. But the B-52 wasn't completing missions. It was looping them. In one now declassified internal audit of the PVO, Soviet Air Defense Forces, analysts discovered that B-52s had re-entered Soviet radar sectors up to 3 separate times in a 36-hour span, without any continuous record linking those contacts as the same aircraft. Each appearance was treated as a new threat logged under different sortie codes. The air defense network had no long-duration memory. More failures followed. SAM commanders routinely reset target acquisition zones after 8 to 10 hours, assuming fuel limits would force any bomber to retreat. But B-52s were now operating in shifts longer than the SAM crews themselves. By the time Soviet batteries reinitialized, the bomber was already repositioning for a fresh threat vector. Even worse, Soviet interceptors were never optimized for endurance chases. MiGs could sprint, but not loiter. The B-52 exploited this, dragging out detection, forcing intercepts, then veering off and re-entering elsewhere. Each failed intercept drained fuel, burned crew hours, and widened the Soviet defense gap. One infamous incident from 1985 told the whole story. A B-52 flew a 29-hour route along the North Atlantic and returned along a similar vector. The same Soviet radar station logged the contact twice, 14 hours apart, without ever realizing it was the same aircraft. The Americans weren't sneaking in. They were waving and staying. The intelligence failure wasn't about radar range or signal clarity. It was about mental framing. The Soviets couldn't comprehend a machine that disobeyed time, that didn't retreat when the shift changed, that didn't vanish after an operation. The B-52 wasn't a blip. It was a fixture. And in a war of nerves, fixtures win. It wasn't the B-52 alone that shattered Soviet expectations. It was the entire system behind it. At first glance, the Stratofortress looked like a relic. Swept wings, 8 engines, a hulking profile that screamed mid-century. But to mistake it for outdated was to miss the brilliance of what it had become, the centerpiece of an airborne ecosystem built for permanence. The B-52 wasn't just flying longer. It was surviving longer, killing longer, and thinking longer. The heart of this capability was airborne refueling. The United States had developed an unprecedented network of KC-135 and KC-10 tanker squadrons, stationed globally and synchronized down to the minute. With this airborne gas station network, a B-52 could lift off from Louisiana and hit targets in the Ural Mountains, without ever touching a runway. Soviets had nothing close. Their own Tu-95s were limited by fuel weight and landing logistics. Refueling was rare, risky, and logistically strained. American refueling, by contrast, was choreographed precision, 4, 5, even 6 fuelings per mission, spaced across continents and time zones. It made the B-52 functionally limitless. But fuel wasn't the only enabler. The B-52 was redesigned internally to function as a flying command center. Long before the digital age, its mission systems allowed real-time strike updates, ECM management, and satellite coordination. In the 1980s, new combat network communications technology, CONNECT, upgrades, gave crews access to live targeting changes, weather intelligence, and nuclear fail-safe protocols. This meant that B-52 crews didn't just follow orders, they adapted mid-air. Even their weapons evolved. By the mid-1980s, the Stratofortress could carry AGM-86B ALCMs, air-launched cruise missiles, each with a range of over 1,500 miles and terrain-hugging accuracy. A single B-52 could launch dozens of these from beyond detection range, turning the aircraft into a mobile missile farm. Suddenly, the bomber didn't have to enter Soviet airspace at all. It could fly parallel to the threat, loiter there, and unleash nuclear payloads without crossing a single border. This was the true system. Endurance wasn't just about staying airborne. It was about being relevant the entire time. Every hour the B-52 was aloft, it remained deadly, connected, and unpredictable. Its defensive suite backed this up. ECM pods jammed Soviet SAMs. Chaff confused radar. Decoys mimicked signatures. Tail gunners, yes, actual gunners, provided last-ditch defense, a feature most bombers abandoned decades earlier. One American general described it like this: "The B-52 is a warship in the sky. It's not an aircraft, it's a platform." Soviets agreed, not out loud, but in how they changed. By the late 80s, the USSR began frantically modifying Tu-160 Blackjack bombers for longer loiter time. They drew up plans for better refueling protocols. They shifted doctrine to include orbital flight patterns and airborne nuclear command relays, but they were years behind. Because what the Americans had built wasn't just a bomber, it was a system of permanent threat. Imagine trying to sleep knowing there is always a bomber just outside radar range, fueled, armed, silent, waiting for a single word to strike. Soviet doctrine had prepared for war. America built a machine that waged pressure. And it wasn't theoretical. In the skies above Europe, Alaska, and the Arctic, that machine was always flying. July 1987. Over the Baltic Sea, began like any other patrol day for Soviet radar crews stationed in Kaliningrad. Early warning arrays lit up with standard NATO activity. A few F-16s buzzing near Denmark. U.S. reconnaissance aircraft shadowing Swedish airspace. Routine. Then, at 0412 hours, a familiar silhouette appeared on the edge of radar range. B-52 Stratofortress. It wasn't unusual to see one, but what followed would leave Soviet command speechless. The bomber held a high-altitude orbit 80 kilometers west of Gotland Island. For the next 9 hours, it didn't deviate. Every 150 minutes, a KC-135 Stratotanker entered the region, refueled the aircraft, then vanished. By hour 12, Soviet command authorized an intercept. Two Su-27s took off from Chkalovsk Air Base. They closed to within 70 kilometers, but never made visual contact. The B-52 simply shifted airspace, dragging the intercept vector off range. The Su-27s returned with nothing. At hour 14, the B-52 was still there, still holding altitude, still unbothered. That's when it dropped its payload, not bombs, dummy munitions and training decoys. They weren't designed to destroy, but to test Soviet response times, chaff clouds, radar reflective flares, electronic bursts. For 6 minutes, the bomber mimicked a full-spectrum strike. Soviet air defense crews fired nothing. They couldn't tell real from fake. Target indicators flashed and vanished. Multiple radar screens overloaded and required manual resets. Confusion spread. And the B-52? It kept orbiting. Hour 18, still flying. A second pair of interceptors was scrambled. Same result. The bomber danced just outside their weapons envelope, then accelerated to reposition. Satellite data later showed that at this point the aircraft had flown over 12,000 kilometers, refueled 4 times, and was still transmitting ECM packets. At hour 22, it finally left. Soviet military response? None. Not a single round fired. Not a single confirmed lock-on. When the logs reached Moscow, the reaction was disbelief. Not just because the B-52 had outlasted every defense vector, but because it had exposed the entire Soviet air doctrine as performative. All of it, interceptors, SAMs, radar towers, was powerless against a single aircraft operating on its own timetable. The post-mission American report, declassified years later, labeled the exercise Strategic Pressure Simulation Bravo. But inside Soviet command, it was called something else. The day the clock broke. Because that's what the B-52 had done. It had broken time, not only by staying aloft for over 26 hours, but by destroying the rhythm Soviet air defenses depended on. Crews were exhausted, unsure when to hand off duties. Officers hesitated, not knowing whether to scramble or wait. Systems blinked under the weight of fake signals and decoy drops. And all of it was done without a single weapon being fired. Not a war. a humiliation. One Soviet general admitted privately, this wasn't combat, it was exposure. They revealed that we were defending against a kind of war that no longer exists. The B-52 didn't need to shoot. Its very presence was the attack. The B-52 had no stealth coating, no Mach 2 speed, no angular shape to dodge radar. It was large, slow, and loud. But in the war rooms of the Soviet Union, it became something far more dangerous than any exotic prototype. It became a disruptor of doctrine. Soviet military ideology was built on rhythms, launch windows, alert cycles, refuel plans, rotation schedules. The idea was that war followed tempo. That offense came in waves, that every weapon system had a shelf life within a battle timeline. But the B-52 refused to obey that structure. It wasn't fast, it was forever. And that was the collapse point. Because every Soviet defense, from MiG interceptors to S-300 missile complexes, had endurance limits. Pilots had to land, radars had to cool, SAM crews had to sleep. But the B-52 did not need rest. Supported by the vast aerial infrastructure of the United States, it could remain a threat indefinitely. This didn't just exhaust Soviet air crews, it discredited their entire philosophy of air power. The USSR had believed that quantity and proximity would define supremacy. More fighters, more missiles, shorter strike distances, faster turnaround times. They believed war would be decided in hours. But America had built a system to fight for days. The Soviets also miscalculated psychologically. They believed deterrence came from fear of destruction. Nuclear warheads, ICBMs, the sudden flash. But the B-52 introduced a more insidious fear. The fear of anticipation. It didn't have to attack. It simply had to be up there, always circling, always capable, always present. Its very endurance stretched the anxiety curve of enemy commanders. This chronic presence turned strategic planners into anxious managers, never certain if the bomber was just observing or preparing a first strike. In war games and simulations, B-52 patrol routes forced Soviet leaders to misallocate assets, to launch intercepts too early or too late, and to waste readiness. Not because of American aggression, but because of American patience. The most crushing realization came not from the bomber itself, but from what followed it. The B-2 Spirit, the B-1 Lancer, cruise missile-equipped submarines. But even with these more modern systems in play, it was the old, lumbering B-52 that remained the most visible and most mentally exhausting threat, because it represented a war without an end time. One former Soviet strategist summed it up after the collapse of the USSR. We feared nuclear war, but what unmade us was the waiting. That plane still in the sky was the waiting. And that is what broke Soviet ideology. Not a strike, not a defeat, but a realization. The enemy had mastered time. It is still up there. The B-52 Stratofortress, designed when Eisenhower was president, when atomic bombs still dwarfed cities, when computers filled entire rooms, remains in service today. Over 70 years since its first flight, the platform continues to patrol skies across the globe. The Soviets are long gone, but the B-52 isn't. Why? Because it was never just a machine. It was a doctrine in motion, a flying principle, that endurance can outlast innovation, that presence is power, that fear does not need speed, it needs patience. Today's B-52s are rebuilt, modernized, smarter, deadlier. They no longer carry tail gunners, but they carry precision-guided bombs, standoff cruise missiles, and digital targeting suites connected to satellites. The crew still suits up for missions that can last 36 hours or more. The ghost of Soviet radar crews still lingers in those cockpits. Every time a B-52 lifts off, it steps back into a Cold War that never truly ended. It circles again. And somewhere, on a screen, in a bunker, on the edge of a hostile frontier, a commander is forced to wonder, how long has it been there? It doesn't need to attack. It just needs to remain, floating above borders, ignoring sleep, outlasting systems. In many ways, the B-52 has already won the war it was built for, not through destruction, but through the simple, grinding fact that it never landed when expected. Its lesson was not about weapons or strategy. It was about will. If the Soviets taught the world that quantity had a quality of its own, the B-52 taught something even more brutal. Endurance is a weapon that still flies, a weapon that still waits, a weapon that whispers to every adversary, "I'm still here."